You're all very welcome back. Our next session is under the title Business, Trade Unions and Society, and we have two, if I can use the phrase, heavyweights from that sector here with us. First of all, we have Danny McCoy. Danny is Chief Executive of IBEC since 2009. Prior to joining IBEC, he was a Senior Economist at both the ESRI and the Central Bank. He's had lecturing posts at Dublin City University, University College London, University of Oxford and Trinity. He's been a consultant for the European Commission and the OECD, and he's a member of the Irish National Competitiveness Council, the National Economic and Social Council and the Export Trade Council. Danny McCoy.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure. It's obviously intimidating to be the first person to speak after Anúchtaráin. Lots of people have a recurring leaving cert nightmare. I luckily don't suffer from that. I do have a waking nightmare of going to the President's speeches because I was a student of his, and not alone did I not know what he was talking about, I couldn't spell most of the words, and I had the same phenomenon come back this morning where there was a word there, I attempted it, and it just doesn't make any sense. So, taking the topic of today, I suppose, is as Michael has indicated, maybe taking somewhat of a business perspective on where we find ourselves in the challenges that the President introduced, which is really this neoliberalism, neoclassical economics paradigm. I think the important challenges we're facing as a society are ones that are actually, to any other generation, would be problems of affluence, not of deprivation. Now that again is a contentious comment because clearly we have lots of people in our society who are experiencing deprivation or the risk of deprivation as defined in relative concept. The absolute transformation, however, of societies in the last number of generations can in no small part be attributed to something that's non-repeatable, which is that since 1980, over half of the world's population have become contestable capitalists, with the emergence of India, China and Eastern Europe of nearly 3 billion people and then 6 billion, now increased to 7.5 billion world. And in that context, Ireland being quite a small, and in fact even in population dynamics relatively it's getting smaller, not bigger in the scale of where the population is going, I think it's germane that sometimes our unit of analysis and frame of reference, which is understandably in this country either somewhat of a little islander view that we have of ourselves or even a little too islander view that we have in the current issues around Brexit. I think it is important to see that the actual entity that we call home, which is Europe, is itself declining. Declining in population dynamics, but also declining in relative strength and power in this world of, not using the word globalization as the President said, becomes contestable, but certainly in this globe. And I think our frame of reference to that European context, I think, is somewhat myopic, that we need to see that, you know, for good or ill, we actually are now positioned centrally rather than peripherally in the world. An inconvenient fact, if you go to a search engine today and put in income per capita ranked, you will find that Ireland is in the top 6 to 8 countries, depending whether it directs you to the CIA World Book or the IMF and so on, in terms of countries in income per capita. And the countries that are in that list may make one somewhat queasy, but what you'll find there is Qatar, Brunei, Macau, Luxembourg, Monaco. You're not finding Denmark or Germany or whatever. So how come this juxtaposition of where we find ourselves in a society, the challenges of the future of work, how do these coexist in our economy and what's happened? Well, very briefly, I suppose, and Michael gave the introduction, I've been an economist for near on 30 years, looking at the Irish economy in its various forms. And so in my lifetime, something very dramatic has changed in the last 5 years in Ireland. Ireland's had the has actually, in household terms, has the equivalent of having won the lottery. And again, the silence of the realization of that in the economy and somehow is stunning. But just like winning the lottery for a household, it can either be the making of that household or can absolutely destroy it. And in fact, if you don't know the difference, you guarantee that you'll be destroyed. And so right now in our society, Ireland is coursing through the veins of this society right now as a consequence of this lottery win. So what is the lottery win that I referred to? And how did it come about? Well, the answer to how it came about is Starbucks. Okay, so here's a theory for you. I'm trying to channel my inner David McWilliams here. So the Starbucks element is that back in 2012, Starbucks were under pressure for corporate taxation front in the United Kingdom, and under pressure decided that they would write a cheque to the British Treasury, which they duly, metaphorically threw in the front door, practically literally threw it in the front door, because it was just a cheque. They gave themselves a kind of an amnesty. So they didn't declare what the money was for or what base it was on or anything like that. So it wasn't a particularly sizable cheque. I can't remember the details, something in the order of 17 million. I'll be discounting millions in a second because I'll start talking about billions. But on the back of that, you know, for the want of a nail, the reaction from Cameron and Osborne was, this has gone too far. We now need to have some alignment on corporate taxation globally. And so along with Obama, they, through the G20, asked the OECD to take a look at this corporation tax front. And as this started to unfold, this new corporate tax regime in which we live in, and we are living in it, the Apple tax judgment and the Paradise Papers are actually referring to a different regime. Nonetheless, they're still topical and issues to be dealt with in society. But the new corporate tax regime, which is under a very boring title of base erosion profit shifting, has been an absolute game changer for Ireland. Of stunning proportions. And so the first manifestation of this is what is, in essence, this new world, and how is it going to change possibly the future of work, but also how is it going to change some of the dynamics around the economy? It's very easily stated. It is that there must now be an alignment between where you have your corporate tax strategy and substance. You must show substance in the jurisdiction in which you've got your corporate tax world. And for a lot of countries in the Panamas and so on, and Paradise Islands, this was devastating. And so what we've seen is that some of those countries, or some of those entities that were mentioned even in the Paradise Papers, like Jersey and so on, that's not where Apple had the taxation. You know, that circle wasn't closed last week. It was just thrown up there in a story. Apple were able to go on the public record last week and say in the last 3 years they've paid 1.27 billion euros to the Irish economy in the last 3 years in corporate tax revenue, a run rate of close to 450 million a year. Now, they haven't gone on the public record what they were doing in the past, but in this new regime, that's indicative of what's going on, because in bringing substance to alignment, we've seen a cascade of corporate migration, which often doesn't have a tangibility for people, but they're balance sheets movements. And so in the modern world of globalization, the new oil is intellectual property and intangible assets that are in balance sheets. And Ireland has been absolute beacon on attraction of this migration. And it's actually for some of those factors that we've talked about before in terms of the nature of the society, in terms of its Anglo-Saxon positioning, its common law legal system, it's part of the European Union, and it also has evolved. It has a 60-year record of building and building on this faith, and then suddenly, when you put the final penny in the slot, the jackpot hits. And the drama about this is dramatic. And the first thing we get is a denial of it actually happening. And so its biggest manifestation was in 2015. Because in 2015, that single year, this migration led to a 40% increase in the corporate balance sheet in Ireland in a single year. Over 300 billion euros of corporate assets were moved into Ireland, with headquarters coming with them, with the C-suite that's around there, the decision makers that need to be required, and its consequences all around us in the city. It seems very silent because it's been pivoted off a few, but as that builds, it starts to become more extensive. And a 40% increase in the corporate balance sheet gave rise to a flow of activity from that balance sheet, which was in the order of about 60 billion euros, which became GDP. And the Irish economy in 2015 grew by 34% in money terms in a single year. And those who misunderstand this say this can't happen. An economy can't increase by 34% in a single year. How could this be? This thing is broken. It's obviously leprechaun economics. And lots of people only too willing to join in the narrative. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Because resource economies, like the Qatars and McCoy and so on, that I mentioned earlier on, resource economies can experience this kind of surge once they have an asset and that asset is very valuable. It also can go down very quickly. So therefore you're in a new situation where you have to start to take some of this money off the table and put it into the infrastructure that I think Jack and the President and so on has been talking about, and for society to build that infrastructure, that social infrastructure. But we have the resources. And for those then that don't believe that, here's some stats. And if you don't know them, you're not alone. But it's, the truth is in plain sight. In 2015, the Irish government anticipated getting corporate tax revenue of 4.3 billion euros. That was the guiding estimate in November of 2015. On the 31st of December 2015, when the money was in, there was 6.9 billion euros of corporate tax revenue. Now these numbers may glaze over in your head, but 2.6 billion is a lot of money. It's 2,600 million of a surprise. And then for a bit of project maths at this hour of the day, on a 12.5% corporation tax rate, that means you multiply that by 8 to give you the profits that were a surprise, that were banked in the Irish economy. This is not portfolios that are passing through the IFSC. This is not a transaction that moves through. These are balance sheets that exist on the 31st and will be there on the 31st of next year and the year after, until some event occurs, perhaps to move them on, but they are substance. And so the 6.9 billion euros has become 7.7 billion in 2016 and over 8 billion, I'm sure, in 2017, and no sign of this going away anytime soon. This is a known known. Brexit is just a known unknown at this stage. This is the resources that are here right now. What's the bad story about these things? The bad story is that when you have an economy that receives this type of injection, of hyper injection, is A, it's very hard to absorb, but B, it has other consequences. And the consequences may superficially seem very good. So first of all, we also know that Irish households' disposable income has grown by 5.5% in the last 12 months, in contrast to our United Kingdom colleagues who are now experiencing real declines. One of the most dramatic effects of Brexit will be the sheer scale of which average households in Ireland and other EU countries will be contrasting with our British neighbours. They're going to take a bit of time before they see that, but that was the turnaround in British society in the 1970s, when they went on holidays to Spain and saw that the Italians and the Germans were richer than them. They couldn't figure out, we won the war, how come they're richer? And eventually you see the kind of re-emergence to the point where, at the point of Brexit, in terms of G7 country, Britain was richer than all of those countries that I've mentioned. Again, they've just shot themselves in the foot. But we have a different story. But it gives rise to a whole host of consequences. Without having a mechanism by which to translate these resources into social infrastructure, we have, in the words of Galbraith, who was mentioned earlier by the President, we are now experiencing the phenomenon of private affluence and public squalor. Again, it's an inconvenient comment, but nonetheless, I think it's got huge validity for those with eyes who just wants to look around when you see the affluence is developing. You could use the pumpkin index as a phenomenon in terms of the scale of the amount of pumpkins that overran the country in Halloween and all the pyrotechnics that were going on around the country as evidence. You look at the airports, which are back at absolutely full capacity. That's not all business. That's, again, the translation of holidays and trips and so on. This is exceeding what went through in the Celtic Tiger period by a factor, in my view, and it's based on substance. But we need, first of all, to acknowledge that it's happening. And therein lies the challenge for Ireland, But there's a more international challenge, which my actual paper is about. I'm not going to read it as a result of time. But there are many, many challenges and disruptions. And some of these disruptions are at the core of our society. The disruption from social media have huge social consequences, potentially for the good, once we get to understand them and control them. But right now, absolutely devastatingly going through our economy in terms of how we try to absorb it. Those of us fortunate enough to be generationally not as savvy or slow to the game and now relieved by the fact that it hasn't overtaken our lives in the way we're watching those who were early movers. The devastation that comes in terms of just the speed of adjustment. The other disruptors in the workplace abound. We see that still nowhere near, but the artificial intelligence, robotics, being transformative. Certainly transformative in the frontier occupations. But as you move through, this type of disruptive technologies have never come together at the same point for any generation. And in fact, where they're driven from is fundamentally that opening up that occurred from 1980, which is once I find I'm half an hour away from the president, I start to get more confident to be able to challenge his thesis. I get absolutely overwhelmed as he comes at it, is that when you mark the time the president was talking about in the Washington Consensus and some of the bad things, also the unleashing of this kind of talent that comes through, both in terms of diversity of nationality and increasingly diversity in terms of gender, will be a huge brain power and game changer to be transformative. This is cascading to us with such viciousness of speed that our societies are finding it difficult to cope. But the other aspect of the Irish story is the economic borders of the state are finished. The economic borders of the state are finished. That's why, in some sense, the Brexit debate, whether it's a hard or soft Brexit, is what we need is a discussion about a resolved border, not a hard or a soft one, because we both societies on both islands, as part of this globalised world, are dealing with much, much greater transformative changes than actually the whole European question. So that when we have the prism, as we often do in this society, and the future of Europe will be an important debate, we too easily get locked in to not observing that the actual forces of globalisation have transformed Irish society. They've transformed it, in my view, in a way that gives us massive opportunity. The opportunities abound. But if we haven't realised we've won the lottery, we've no way of actually harnessing the benefits of it, but we will experience all the costs of it. And that will be brought through very firmly, not just in our society and in our homes, but also in the workplace. And so as leaders in this society, or people who think about it, it's behoving on us to actually have a constructive and civic dialogue between business, unions, voluntary groups, and the state. But I would contend that the state is actually way behind where other parts of civic society are right now, because those economic borders of the state are dissolving in front of our eyes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danny. And next up, we have Jack O'Connor from SIPTU. Jack has been General President of SIPTU since 2003. He was also President of ICTU from 2009 to 2011 and served previously as Vice President from mid-07. He's been a member of the Executive Council of Congress since 2001, and he's also a member of the European Economic and Social Committee. Jack O'Connor, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mick, and good afternoon, everybody. I have to say, first of all, that my paper has a virtually exclusively domestic focus. I very deliberately entitled it Rebalancing Things a Bit. But that being said, it does attempt to recognise the context in which we're engaging in this discussion. And the context has been described by Danny McCoy far better than I describe it. But we all now know that we're well into the fourth industrial revolution, the age of digitalisation, and we all well know that it has the potential to see a scale of change. It's already underway that is unprecedented in all of human history. And yet, lest we get carried away with it, all of this dramatic new world is unfolding at a time when we are witnessing mass migrations on a biblical scale as people flee oppression and war. And at the same time, as those two phenomena are unfolding, we're also now recognising that the consequences of 300 years about the history of capitalism, 300 years of unsustainable exploitation of the resources of the planet have come home to roost, and in the form of environmental degradation, and they're threatening the very future of the ecosystem itself. So we have these three dynamics interacting. And this is the context in which we here in this country are emerging from what has been the most serious economic collapse experienced in any developed country in the world since the Wall Street crash of 1929. And of course, in many respects, the rebound has been quite dramatic. Danny, I think, described the rebound and the factors that are playing into it better than I would. But our unemployment rate, to mention just one statistic, is now heading down about 6% from 15% in the depths of the crisis. And some people would say that things are getting back to as good as they have ever been, back to the good old days. However, the problem is that the good old days were never good for everyone. They were only good for some people. And the great tragedy is that we are again making the same policy choices. And I distinguish choice from failure. You can make the right choice and something goes wrong and it doesn't work out. These are not failures. These are choices. We are choosing to do what we've done before. We are choosing the same inequitable route that gave rise to the collapse in the first place. And these choices have enormous implications for our society, and they mitigate greatly, by the way, against our long-term productivity and our future social and economic development. And I'm not going to develop that today because I assume that everybody in the room agrees with that, but nonetheless it's important to say it. People's capacity to participate in society, in the workings of and in the evolution of democracy, are predetermined by their economic circumstances. And as a trade unionist, I hold that the key determinant of an individual's quality of life, in the fullest sense of the term, is derived from the benefits accruing to them through their economic and social engagement in the world of work. And while this relates to the monetary income derived, it does extend to embrace a whole number of other aspects which are less definable than simply counting money. And in this context, the picture that is emerging or re-emerging in post-crisis Ireland must give rise for a great deal of concern, because there is an absolute wealth of anecdotal evidence, and some emerging now of the harder statistical kind, as to the nature and the character of the reality in our workplaces, which is camouflaged by bland statistics about economic growth. Because no less a body than the OECD estimates that Ireland was the third most unequal country in Europe after Greece and Portugal in 2015. And that's based on market income. Social transfers do ameliorate it to an extent. I would say they keep a lid on it, basically. That's what the system of social transfers does. And this manifests itself in a number of characteristics. Low pay. The OECD and Eurostat data both confirm that Ireland has one of the highest levels of low pay among the developed economies, and that the risk of being low paid is greatest for women, young workers, non-Irish nationals, and among part-time workers. About 600,000 people, about 30% of total employment, work in wholesale and retail, accommodation and food services, administrative and support services, and then a smaller proportion in agriculture, forestry and fishing. And these are the sectors of the economy in which low pay is most prevalent. It's also, incidentally, and it's more difficult to measure it, very prevalent in the caring sectors of the economy. And according to CSO data from February 2017, 35.1% of the people who go to work in Ireland earn less than €400 per week. Over a third of the people who go to work. And Pubble's early years sector profile for 2016 and 2017, a very useful piece of work, which is worth visiting, highlights the degree to which low pay prevails on a frightening scale among the categories of worker who are responsible for looking after children and early years learning and so on. And the 6th European Working Conditions Survey conducted by Eurofound, released in 2016 in respect of 2015, found that they were looking at precarious work, and they produced figures for the entire workforce. But the most dramatic conclusion they reached was that if you look at the people who are under 35, 46% of the people under 35 who were at work in 2015 were in what they termed non-standards of contracts of employment of one kind or another. One kind or another. And then there is the question of job quality. And the OECD classifies us as being a moderate performer on job quality. Incidentally, that's not too bad. But we're not in the top tier by any means. And one of the ways in which that manifests itself is in relation to pension provision. Because 53% of the people who go to work in Ireland have no pension protection, no pension cover whatsoever, other than the state, the basic state pension. And of the 47%, a proportion which is not that easy to measure, but you could say a third to a half of them have quite inadequate provision. Incidentally, until quite recently anyway, one of the characteristics of being of somebody who was in a trade union, which was recognised by the employer, and someone who was not, in these categories, was whether or not you had a pension scheme of one kind or another. And this low pay and precarious or indecent work plays into an increasingly dysfunctional social framework, which delays relationship and family formation and the prospect of full and decent lives. And this phenomenon has wider societal implications in terms of health, mental health, work-life balance, housing, etc. Because in Ireland, the structural inequality in the workplace is exacerbated rather than diminished in the wider social context. And our public spending as a share of gross national income is joint bottom of the list of EU countries and 1/3 less than the average EU member state. And it's quite evident in this slide. And we're using GNP for Ireland and GDP for all of the other countries, because when you use GDP, the screen wouldn't be big enough to capture the extent, and it probably, in fairness, wouldn't be that real either. But this dramatic deficit in public expenditure manifests itself in an exponentially growing housing crisis, major inadequacies in the public health service, and a less than optimal educational system. And the point is, I'm increasingly worrying about myself, because I find myself agreeing more and more with some of the things that Danny McCoy and Ibe are saying, but then I have to remind myself that I was saying them before they came on the pitch. But it is important that we recognise that things do not need to be this way. As has been stated earlier by Danny, we have I don't think he said it this way, but we are in the place now, 5 years from the centenary of the foundation of our state, where we actually have the capacity to realise a great deal of the aspirations which were enshrined in the democratic programme, the centenary of which arises in 2 years' time, and which was the basis upon which the War of Independence was fought. Government finances are now effectively balanced, and the current budget surplus, inclusive of interest, for the period 2018 to 2021 is projected to reach over 20 billion euro. If you extrapolate it out to 2022, so as to coincide exactly with the centenary, it's 25 billion. And even allowing for the very restrictive fiscal rules, incidentally, our own fiscal rules now, not fiscal rules that are imposed from outside, our own from now on, the government's own projections envisage about 14 to 15 billion euro. That it is possible to spend that amount of money on top of what we're spending at the minute over that period, without raising any additional revenue. And then if you look at the potential to increase that figure, it's quite conceivable that it can be doubled by a combination of revenue-raising measures, which are not quite dramatic and don't impact to any significantly discernible extent on people's incomes, maybe a little on the incomes of people who don't know what to do with it, but other than that. And other measures like the abolition of the giveaway to the employers who are coining it in the hospitality sector, who refuse to share it with their workers, by the way, are among the lowest paid workers in the state, which is costing this year 461 million, exactly the same amount as the so-called odious property tax, which I incidentally agree with, by the way, but about the same amount. And if you multiply that out by 5 years, you're looking at about €2.5 billion, and that translates roughly into 12,000 houses in the middle of a housing crisis. But we're giving it to people who are making fortunes in an industry that's now booming. So it's easy to see how we can do 25 billion, maybe a bit more, stretching our own fiscal rules maybe a little. And then there is the potential of what this money can do. But the problem is, and this is the problem, that while you can do a great deal with that money, you can't do it if you insist on cutting taxes at the same time. I'm not arguing, by the way, because every time I say this, it's deliberately misrepresented. I'm not arguing for any increase in taxes of any magnitude at all. And the crunch issue really is the question of public investment versus tax cutting. The simple fact of the matter is that huge progress can be made without ramping up taxation, but there's no room for tax cutting. And in this regard, we have to confront the ingrained mythical equation of tax cutting with the misleading concept of the tax break. If I had €50 for every time I was asked by somebody in the media during budget, in the run-up or the aftermath of the recent budget, do you not think that your members are entitled to a break? Well, actually I do. But I don't think they're entitled to be screwed in the form of a break. But there is this assumption that tax cutting equates with a break. It doesn't. Because the fact of the matter is that it's not a break if the consequence of sustained, systematic under-provision of public investment as a result of these so-called tax breaks, incrementally, over a number of years, results in appreciating costs which must be borne by ordinary families otherwise. For example, we end up with a huge proportion of our citizens, now I think approaching a majority, very close to a majority, paying exponentially increasing premiums for private health insurance because they don't trust the public health service. And the impact of the cost of housing and accommodation, if you'll excuse the pun, going through the roof, manifests itself in countless different ways that I don't have time to outline here, in the pockets not just of the people who are homeless, by the way. And then, of course, we have the other costs that have to be borne in relation to education fees and childcare fees and all of that, as a result of so-called tax breaks, which disproportionately, inevitably, by the way, benefit the better off. And I'm saying that the situation here calls out for detailed and thorough analysis of the impact of the cost of living on the entire range of costs which must be borne by individuals living in Ireland, of systematic underinvestment in public provision over the past 3 or 4 decades. It should be possible, hasn't been done yet, hasn't even been tried. There are reasons for that too, by the way. It should be possible to arrive at a relatively precise figure of how much the so-called tax breaks over those years translate into a hole in people's pockets, a big hole in people's pockets. But undertaking such an exercise would entail a great deal more than just simple arithmetic. It would extend beyond the analysis of public policy choices and instruments to a look at the very value system that underpins them. Because the value system that informs the given, the journalists who are asking me, do you not think that your members are entitled to a tax break? They are saying that to be provocative. But they also believe themselves that the tax break is a good idea. And the value system that reflects this given is a value system which reflects the interests of the dominant class in society. They determine the value system. And by the way, lest I be accused of concentrating the fire on the right of the political spectrum, I just want to say as well that many of the people who see themselves on the left have been seduced by the tax-cutting myth as well. They promote the same agenda, albeit via a different narrative. They talk about abolishing property tax and so on. And the fact of the matter is that this is no more socially progressive than the agenda that is being promoted by the centre-right parties. The bottom line, irrespective of how you do it, is that tax cutting disproportionately benefits the better off to the detriment of the quality of our public services and the people who depend on them, which are not just a minority of people who have been marginalised. They are pretty much everybody, or very nearly everybody. And that in turn results in people who have it, not terribly wealthy people, most people in the middle, having to pay far more for basic services which should be regarded as rights in a civilised society. And of course, for those who cannot pay, it means languishing on waiting lists with implications for people's long-term health, resulting in premature death and in the society that, as Danny has pointed out, ranks among, on a per capita basis, the top 6 richest in the world. And what I'm saying here is this, is it's time to debunk the slick, simplistic myth that cutting tax puts money in people's pockets. It doesn't. Or at least it only puts it in very few people's pockets. And we have to deal with that myth. Now, there is another point I want to make, and I know I'm running over my time, in relation to something that I don't think has been picked up, and it's this. I referred earlier to the Eurofund survey that highlighted the fact that about 46% of the people who are under 35 are on these non-standard precarious contracts of employment. They account for a significant proportion of those on low pay as well, by the way. And if you look at the 2016 census in relation to housing, it reveals that just over 30% in 2016 of householders are living in rented accommodation. That's a 39% increase in the figure for 10 years earlier, in 2006. And if you look at what's happening to inflation on house prices, whereas we have a pretty low level, near zero level of inflation in the economy, on house prices, depending on which measure you use, for 2017 alone, depending on which set of figures you use, it's increasing at a rate of between 6 and 10% a year. Now, I wonder what figure would a study designed to establish what proportion of the 46% are in the 30, I'm sure it's now 33%. So we have a situation, and it makes obvious sense that the people in the 46%, the people in these abysmal, brutal contracts, feature very prominently in the people who are being ripped off by the landlords, because they're the last people into the market. And what, I wonder, are the social consequences down the road of consigning such a huge proportion of the next generation into this misery? And what's going to happen if they ever wake up to the fact that it didn't need happen at all, and that it is almost entirely a consequence of our generation awarding ourselves so-called tax breaks? And the other and last thing is this, is that this 46%, who constitute inevitably a huge proportion of the people who are being ripped off on the rent side, are the people we never hear. They don't attend the conferences such as this. They, to a large extent, are not organised in trade unions, because in this country one doesn't have a right to engage in collective bargaining. And in a precarious contract, if you put your head over the parapet, you won't be around for long. And it raises another question for another day about whether or not, in the season of referendums, that it's not time to think about a referendum to enfranchise the people who have no say in the workplace by providing for a positive right to collective bargaining in our Constitution. We've already voted on it, by the way. It's provided for in Article 28 of the Lisbon Treaty, of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Lisbon Treaty, which we adopted back in 2009 in a referendum. It's about time that we dealt with some of the myths that are crucifying our society, and not just the people who are prepared to tolerate in the margins. Thank you all.
Okay, folks, as you may appreciate with the President's address, we're slightly behind time, so we have and Jack also has to leave us pretty soon on a scheduled. We have a bit of time for a couple of questions. If we could I'll just take lady here and gentleman here. I'll take those two questions first before we let the two men reply.
Catherine Lynch, I'd like to say congratulations and thank you for 30 years. And I think it's a good time to call it so we can move forward better and together. At a conference today, which is about our values and about our future, we are looking at all male panels of great men at the top of their organisations talking about the arguably big and broad questions. And we're also looking at an all-female panel, also of great women, asking the question around local participation at a time in the day when people are likely to be getting the train so they can go home and do that local and often care work. And I think when we realize and we see that the consequence of our decisions is that men are here and women are here, we are given a sign because we can see there's a flaw in our design and in how we organize our people and how we're organizing our thoughts. And at a time when the New Yorker poses the question, and Silicon Valley, as Danny kind of alluded to there, is arguably answering the question whether artificial intelligence or humans will actually shape our future, it's time that we stop lagging behind this question of gender balance. Thank you. We'll be stronger together and we'll have a brilliant one in 40 years.
Thank you. Just this man here, just to point out that our last panel, the female speakers in the majority in the afternoon are also, just to make the point. We'll just take that man here. I think he is.
Jack, Jesus, sorry. Just to take you up on your last point, two remarks on the trade union movement. Firstly, organisation of working people. In today's world, obviously, trade union was the uniting of people of trades. There doesn't really exist trades much anymore. So how do you organise people who are on zero-hour contracts, who are migrants, who are working in childcare, who are foreign migrants exploited by housewives who are taking them to the cleaners for a 7-day week? How do you organise present-day labour, firstly? And then secondly, just about yourself, or the trade union movement within itself, how is the morale? Without any personal insult or anything, it seems strange that you're still in your role for how many years? 7, 10, 15? Where's the new Jack O'Connor, or where are the other trade unionists coming from? David Beggs was a great trade union activist, but I don't see any successor of David or the many, many trade union leaders that we respected in 10, 20 years ago. Where is the new dynamic coming within the trade union movement?
Okay, we've one man down here and just up here. I'm afraid we're under time pressure. I'm sorry now. It's just behind at the back, I think, in fairness to him. And Michael up here at the front. Just if you can keep it brief, please.
Hi, I'm Damon Matthew Wise, capital A circumflex, U circumflex. I'm National Secretary and CEO of the National Council of People with Disabilities. In view of the fact that Ireland is ratifying the UN Convention on Human Rights for Persons with Disability, I was wondering how can business and unions engage us as the national representative body to bring people with disabilities in from outside to mainstream and to get more people. For example, in the USA alone, 1.5 million autistics are placed in science, in arts, and in ICT. Silicon Valley has found that 98% of the children born in Silicon Valley are autistic. For some strange supply, they've recruited them from universities all over the USA and ended up having an autistic cluster. Now, we have Facebook, we have Google, lots of companies in Ireland, but they're recruiting people from recruitment agencies from Sweden, from Denmark, from the Netherlands, from Germany into Ireland. Why aren't we doing more to mainstream people with disabilities in Ireland, and what can we do? Thanks.
Okay, I'll just take Michael here, a brief contribution.
I have a question to Danny McCoy. When you are talking about the big lottery win of Ireland, why do you forgo the big lottery win of Google taxes, which the European Commission decided upon? Okay,
Danny, if you go first, and then Jack, if you can just, in general response there, as much as possible within the...
To Michael, in the first instance, this community are actually quite agnostic on the Apple tax issue. If it is proven that Apple and the Irish government, that such a thing, that's to the detriment of other businesses, actually. So as a business community, we accept the bona fides of both entities till proven otherwise, and so that's under European court. So both parties have come out to state that they're not in a situation, so they're appealing that. What I would say about the Apple tax judgment, it relates to the double Irish phenomenon, which is one of those, the systematic break in corporate taxation, is the point I was making earlier on. We're in a different world, but that will fall where it will. And if it is the case, then there will be a windfall to Ireland. But I don't think it will actually turn out that way, because we're dealing with globalised entities. Apple gone on the public record to say they'd moved substance into Ireland during 2015. The Apple tax judgment relates to a different phenomenon when they weren't incorporated here, they weren't resident here. And so we won't get the money, is the answer ultimately on that front, unless we're in a very different situation with the European Commission. On the disability issue, I think that the workplaces of the future, I think, are much more conducive, because of the cognitive, over half of the jobs now require strong cognitive skills, which are actually to the detriment of those who don't finish their educational. So it'll be actually mediated through educational disadvantage rather than what we currently define as disabilities. But again, even in that terminology is probably a way to reframe what we do in the workforce. And so increasingly, I think that in the absence of having a social partnership type context, we're not asking for social partnership back, but with no way of mediating this problem we currently face, where we have affluence at the private sector, people looking for tax cuts, but all around us, the things that frustrate us are the lack of public infrastructure. People spend, not everybody, but some people are spending more time travelling to work than they get annual leave right now when you accumulate up those hours in the day. That's a phenomenon that actually is detrimental to both the employers and the individuals and to society more generally. And yet we have the mechanism by which we can translate some of those wage increases or tax cuts into actually funding. But the fundamental problem is us as society, our unwillingness to actually pay for things because we want somebody else to pay for them. Water charges, educational fees, all of these provide the possibility of not just the 25 billion that Jack is talking about, but to leverage public-private partnerships to deliver yet more. So it's our immaturity, our antipathy towards the state that we profess to love, but unwillingness to actually provide the resources to that state, provide the infrastructure. So we're our own creators of the problems we're currently in. We have won the lottery, but we just don't seem to be mature enough to be able to allocate it or deal with it sensibly.
Okay, Jack, those points, do you address?
Yeah, well, I think I'll just concentrate on the points made by that man there, who I should know, because I think the other points have been addressed. In relation to this question of organising people in precarious work and what new formula do we have to employ? Well, the reality of it is that we don't have to employ a new formula. Jim Larkin did that when he came to this city in 1909. The great majority of the people he organised were not tradespeople. They were workers in precarious employment, or casual workers, very vulnerable people. And he employed a method of organising that focused beyond the immediate question of pay and conditions and onto the wider social agenda, which our trade union movement is not really doing to the extent that it could and it should anymore, because the trade union movement, no less than everybody else, reflects the value system that prevails in our society. And actually, ironically, it did decide at 3 successive biennial delegate conferences in 2011, 2013, 2015 to transform itself, to enable it to take on that task and to imitate what Larkin did. Because essentially what Larkin did was he built the idea of OBU, one big union, where the people who were strong would extend their solidarity to the people who are weak, so that the people who are weak wouldn't ultimately undermine their pay in terms of employment by working for nothing. But our movement, our trade union movement, hasn't gone beyond making the decision to make the transformation. it's my only reason for regretting the better economic circumstances. If it had continued for another while, our movement would probably have transformed itself because it would have had to. In relation to David Begg and so on, well, David has been replaced as General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions since March of 2015 by Patricia King. And Patricia is doing that work, a very difficult job. And in relation to myself, you'll be glad to hear that after 14 and a half years as President of the Union, I stepped down 3 weeks from next Thursday. And I was re-elected 3 times. And for a while I thought it was because it was a vote of confidence. Until somebody pointed out to me it had nothing to do with confidence. It was only the fact that you made the job look that difficult to do that nobody wanted it. I do want to take up a point that Danny made in his response. I was hoping that he'd say something that I could disagree with. But I do disagree with something. I do disagree with something he said, and I don't disagree with the sentiment behind it. But it's this: is that I don't think we should say that the people who protested against the water charges and the property tax were protesting on the basis that they didn't want to pay for anything. It arose in the context of a very unfair formula which was imposed as a result of the collapse. That's the first point. And the second point is this: it took me a long time to come to understand this, because I've been active in the trade union movement for about 44 years. It took me 10 years to come to understand this. That the outlook of the people who are down the various tiers of society, if you accept the analogy of the pyramid, the outlook is framed by the given that is determined by those at the top of society. The outlook is framed by the value system. And we have been cultivating a set of values here for a very long time that translates into tax cutting is a good idea because it puts money in people's pockets without telling people that it's only a small number of people whose pockets it's put into. But the great majority of people believe it. And we have to engage in a battle of ideas, and we have to produce the evidence to show what we will do with the tax that we can convince them to contribute, and how it will transform their lives. And because there are too many people in too many positions of influence in society who have a vested interest in not telling that tale, people are not being told.
Okay, folks, this is a conversation that I think we all agree could go on a lot longer. Unfortunately, the clock has beaten us, and I don't want to go back to you, Danny, about water charges. I think that's been done to death in the last few years. Can I just say before finishing, Jack may be leaving in 3 weeks' time, but I certainly hope that forums like this still receive the benefit of what he has to give in terms of public debate from now on. I'd also just like to thank Jack, obviously, and I'd also like to thank Danny McCoy, both of them, for very thoughtful contributions here today.